All right, this is part two of my report, citizens report for North Carolina DPI data for Wake County Public School System. My name is Blaine Dillard, and I've already did a video for part one. Hope you'll check that out. This one is hopefully going to be a little shorter. I'm just going to talk about Math 1 metrics and trying to explain what they are based on my learning here. So again, I said this in the last video. I wanted to share the sources that I'm using, try to reference on all the pages where the sources are. And again, I just want to make a disclaimer that all this is a sort of a labor of love here. I've spent a lot of hours looking over all this data over many weeks, asking a lot of questions of various people and reading and trying to understand, and done a lot of manual calculations through Excel and PowerPoint, and a lot of copies and sorts and filters and whatnot. So I've tried to be accurate, but I'm a human and I make mistakes. So hopefully, if I make a mistake in here and you find something, please report that to me and I'll try to correct it. Try to do my best to be accurate. Okay, so let's talk about banking. This is a very important foundational definition. Banking is probably not just North Carolina, but the definition I found was in a North Carolina website, and it basically explains that North Carolina students that are enrolled in an end-of-course assessment, and that test is administered at the end of the course, regardless of what grade the student is in. But in some cases, those scores are used later when that student is in a different grade. For example, maybe they take a middle school test, such as Math 1 EOC or Biology EOC in middle school, but that needs to be reported at the high school level in the school accountability reporting. So they will bank that score, and then I call it unbanking later on. So that is what banking means. So let's just give a quick example here, showing a couple of fictional students here. In 2015, Avni and Gina both are in middle school, 7th and 8th grade respectively, and Ty is in 9th grade. They all take the EOC, and the way North Carolina DPI calculated it then, they did actually record those scores against these respective schools that those students were at. So you would see the scores that Avni and Gina did, not individually, but as they roll up to their middle school, you know that data is there represented at the middle school level. You would see that in 2015, 16, etc. But those scores are also banked for later. They're put away for when these students get to high school. Okay, so then in 2016, Gina is now in middle school, and the same school that Danielle is at. Okay, Danielle's in 9th grade. Gina is now in 9th grade. Now Gina's scores are going to be unbanked and counted along with Danielle's scores in their high school's scores. Okay, so even though Gina didn't take the EOC at that particular high school, it will get counted, and given credit towards that high school. So that's, I would say, one of the deficiencies of the way this system has worked, and it did change in 2018, as we'll talk about in a moment. But continuing on, we also have Marcus in 8th grade who took the EOC. And because he's in 8th grade, his scores counted against his middle school, but also were banked. And you'll notice that Avni, who was in 7th grade in 2015, now in 8th grade in 2016, her scores are still in the bank. Okay, so they're not coming out of the bank until she reaches the 9th grade, and that would be in 2017, along with Marcus, when he would reach 9th grade, and then his score and Avni's score would be unbanked and would count in their high school in 2017. Okay, so hopefully this explains banking. Okay, so now moving along, we're going to talk about some definitions here. So we already understood what banking is. Now let's start talking about some of the metrics. In 2016 and 17, and even before that, the metrics that DPI collected were pretty generically named. You had metrics, for example, the EOG Math Grade 8, and let's say the Math 1 EOC. So you would see metrics like that in the data in the data sets themselves. And so for these years that we're going to be covering here, 2016, 17, that EOG for math grade 8, that was just the EOG taken by 8th graders, taken by all 8th graders. Even if they took the Math 1 EOC, they also would take the math grade 8 EOG. So some students were being tested twice in that scenario. Then the Math 1 EOC, again, that test was taken by many students. And as I mentioned earlier, we talked about banking. Those scores would be banked for ones that were in middle school. And then once they reached 9th grade, the scores would be unbanked and would count at the 9th grade level. Okay, so that's 2016, 17, and really years before that. That's pretty much how it worked. So things started to change in 2018 for the better, I believe. And so let's talk through those. We'll look at 2018 and 19 school years. So M8 SEP, there's 4 new metrics introduced related to math, I would say. M8 SEP is one of them. That is now reflects the math EOG at 8th grade only. So in this case, it's just the students that are having to take the EOG in the 8th grade. Because in 2018, the state introduced a new rule, which is the students don't have to take both the EOG and the EOC. So if they're in Math 1 in 8th grade, they can just take the Math 1 EOC. They don't have to take the EOG. So this was a big difference because now all of a sudden in 2018, you had lots of 8th graders that all of a sudden were not taking the EOG. And I've talked about that in the prior video. You can see some of the scores and how that affected the scores of those students. So again, M8 SEP is just the EOG at the grade 8 level. Then there's this other metric called MAO8, and that was a metric that the DPI calculated, and it was essentially a blending of all those 8th graders that took the EOGs blended with the 8th graders that took the EOCs, the Math 1 EOC. So they're still trying to create I guess a pseudo overall 8th grade math score by blending the EOG takers and the EOC Math 1 EOC takers, and they did that, called that MAO8. And then the next metric we're going to transitioning into Math 1 now. There's a metric called M1 SEP. That is the score of Math 1 EOC at the 8th grade level only. Okay, and that includes banked scores that are now banked to 8th grade, because starting in 2018, the DPI they began doing the unbanking at the 8th grade level. So like, for example, if somebody took the Math 1 EOC in 6th grade or 7th grade, that would get put in the bank. And then, beginning in 2018, when that student gets to 8th grade, that would be unbanked and would count at that point. So that's the same for 2018 and 19. The reason this text is in red here, where it says includes it banked NC Math 1 scores to grade 8, same comment as over here. The reason I put it in red is because the official definition in the documentation that I pulled off at DPI, this is the official definition word for word for M1 SEP. And that definition for M1 SEP for 2018 did not include this red part. It only included this part here. So I thought for a while that those two were different, but I did clarify that with Curtis Salmon at North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and he assured me that the M1 SEP definition for 18 and 19 is the same, and that comment was just added in 19 to be a little bit more clear. So the comment in parentheses applies to both years. So again, I'm trying to be precise here and accurate, do my homework, and make sure I'm very clear and precise about what these metrics mean. Okay. All right. So far so good. Hopefully these 3 metrics consistent. 2018, 2019, these are consistently measured and managed during those 2 years. The one that's a little different is M1. Okay, so M1 introduced in 2018. It is a metric that measures the North Carolina Math 1 EOC test takers in high school. And I know this says to grade 13, and I guess this is grade 13 would be a case of students that maybe didn't graduate after 12th grade, and maybe they go to summer school or something. So let's just assume that's what that is. But anyway, the high school Math 1 EOC, that is what M1 is. And for the case of 2018, that is the last year that bank scores would be included in that metric. So, okay, actually, since that's the first year of that metric, the sort of the exception year, the M1 metric includes banked scores at ninth grade for that year in 2018. Starting in 2019, no more bank scores in this M1 metric, because at that point, all the banking is occurring at the eighth grade level. Okay, so the banking stopped on in 2018, and then in 2019, it was no longer happening at the M1 level. So bottom line to this whole chart here is the Math 1 EOCs earned in middle school were banked to ninth grade until 2018, which was the last year of ninth grade banking and the first year of banking to the eighth grade. So hopefully that makes sense. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's go for, how about a table is worth 500 words? So this is a table attempting to explain what was on the prior page. I'm just showing examples here, and let's start at the bottom left corner. So what this table is showing by the year, what happens with these students when they take the Math 1 EOC. Okay, so we'll start down here. 2016, if somebody in high school takes the EOC, it counts against the 2016 EOC. If an eighth grader takes the EOC at that point, it would count against their middle school EOC metrics, but it's also banked for use when they get to ninth grade. Okay, so it's banked to their 2017 EOC Math 1. So I just draw an arrow here to show that that's banked and will show up later here. Okay. Moving on up, 2016, a seventh grader takes the EOC. That counts against their middle school in 2016, but their score is also banked until they're going to get into the ninth grade. Okay, so that would be in 2018. So that their score is banked, and then 2 years later they're in ninth grade, and that would be unbanked and would count here in the 2018 M1 metric. Now note, this is the last year that banking or unbanking, I guess, is occurring at the ninth grade level. Okay, let's move on up. Sixth grader in 2016, they take the EOC. It counts against their middle school. It's also put in the bank, and then time elapses. Time elapses, and then by the time they get to 2018, they're in eighth grade. And this is the first year of eighth grade unbanking. So their score, the sixth grader, their score would get unbanked and would count against their eighth grade EOC in 2018, and it would be under the M1 SEP metric. Okay, so it's coming in right there. Similarly, you got these, any of the other ones here, similar kind of theme. 2017, a sixth grader, their scores are going to be banked. It'll come out in 2019 when they're in the eighth grade. And then as you can see, there's no more banking action occurring on these ninth graders starting in 2019. So the M1 metric becomes more pure in 2019. And then the M1 SEP metric is the one that holds all the banked scores starting in 2018. Okay, so now we have a picture that perhaps is worth 1,000 words, but maybe after the prior table, this is not as complicated as it looks. What I'm trying to show here is a visual of what I just explained, and basically what we have here is, again, I'm showing the prior years just to show that there were some prior years prior to 2016 where some students were taking the EOC, their scores were being put up in the bank, and then as they progress through time, their scores are coming out. So similar to the prior page, we have the bank up at the top, we have middle school here in the middle, we have high school at the bottom, and there's this line here that separates it separates the high school and the middle school. So in 2016, there's let's say these three students in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. They each take the EOC. Their scores count at the middle school level against the Math 1 EOC metric. Okay. Additionally, this person down here in high school takes the Math 1 EOC, and their scores count against their high school metric. These count against the middle school metrics. These count against high school metrics. But additionally, in 2016, this blue person, this yellow person, and purple person, from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, respectively, in prior years, 2013, 2014, 2015, their middle school EOC scores were banked previously. They're coming out of the bank now and are going to count against whatever high school they're in. So that will get counted um, at that point as well. So then we move over to 2017. Now we have, again, 3 grades of students taking the Math 1 EOC. It counts against their middle school. There's a high school student that counts against their high school EOC metrics. And then here's a few bank students that are coming out. So this 6th grader from 2014, they were still sitting in the bank in 2016. Now this person's in the 9th grade. Their scores are going to count against the high school's Math 1 EOC. Okay, and similarly for these other students as well. Then we get over to 2018. We've got students taking the EOC in middle school. Now notice something here. Whereas in 17 and prior, the middle school scores counted right away against their middle school metrics. That doesn't happen anymore in 2018. The credit towards the middle school only occurs in the 8th grade. So the 6th grader and 7th grader who took the EOC in middle school, their scores are essentially go directly to the bank, and only the 8th graders' scores are going to count towards that middle school's EOC scores, towards those middle school's EOC metrics. Okay. Then we've got here's these unbanked scores coming from these 2 6th graders and 7th graders. These are going to count at the M1 SEP and the M1 SEP metric at that middle school level. Okay, so they'll start counting once these students reach the 8th grade. And then similarly, in high school, there's a student taking M1. This is the last year of banking. This 8th grader was in 8th grade in 2017. They're in 9th grade now. Their scores would get unbanked and count in the 2018 M1 metric. Similarly, the 7th grader was in the 7th grade in 2016. Now they're in the 9th grade. It'll go into the M1 metric. And this is in 2018, last year of any kind of banking scores counting at the high school level. Okay. Then 2019 gets a little bit more clean here. Middle schoolers taking the test. Only the 8th grade ones are going to count right into M1 SEP. The unbanked ones from prior years, those will go into M1 SEP. There's no high school banking or unbanking anymore for Math 1. And then the Math 1 student in high school, theirs would obviously count against the M1 metric. And then I guess I've already talked about the middle schools. These 6th and 7th graders, they go into the bank for use in 2020. So hopefully that makes sense. If you stare at this chart long enough, I hope I've got all the figures right and the grades and whatnot, but hopefully this gives you a picture of what's really happening here with these scores.